Some other things about Luke. Luke is an eyewitness in the book of Acts. Because we're going to read, as the author in chapter 16, verse 10, he uses the word we. So now he's with Paul. In chapter 16 and in chapter 20, 21, 22, we're going to read we. Chapter 27, 28, we're going to read we. He was on the ship. He was going through the shipwreck. And Luke was an eyewitness to many of these things that he gives an account to. I want you to understand that. Back to the dating piece. A couple of things we know that are not mentioned in the book of Acts. We'll start with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's a testified historical fact that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. That's not mentioned in the book of Acts. Actually, it's not mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. So historians believe that there would be something mentioned of that because it was such an incredible event. Okay, imagine if someone burned the White House to the ground in 2021. Would a historian include that in their history of America? Yeah, they would. Sorry about that, Facebook people. I think you can hear me now. Yeah, they're like, I can't live for you. Don't worry, I can't either. Jen will look at me and say something like, I got nothing. What? Horrible. I can't live for you, though. Maybe some of you can. So we know that the destruction of Jerusalem is not mentioned as 70 AD. We also know that Paul died roughly 64 to 67 AD, and Acts 28 ends with Paul in house arrest in Rome. So he's still alive. So it has to be before that date. We also know that James was stoned by Annas ben Annas, and that means Annas the son of Annas, about 61 or 62 AD. And that is not mentioned. And James, being the brother of Jesus, the one who wrote the book of James. Right? You go through the Bible and you're like, Hebrews, James. Who wrote James? Jesus' brother. And he dies about 61. So that wasn't mentioned. So we know that it was probably done by 61, 62 AD. So that gives us some timing. So that helps us understand that better. I think it's also important to understand this, and John Stott says it very well in his book, Evangelical Truth. There are certain things that are one-time events. Okay, he uses the word, the Greek word, happens. And he says there's certain things that are a one-time event, okay? It's H-A-P-A-X, and it's a once for all. Okay, so for example, God's revelation to humanity in the Bible was written once for all. Nobody's going to show up and say, I've got a new book in the Bible. Okay? And if they do, don't listen to them, because they're a false teacher. The birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ is all once for all. Okay, Christ doesn't have to die again, which is one of the problems with certain churches that believe that their communion is the death of Christ. Every time they get together and do it, they believe that it's actually the new blood of Christ, so it's like he's dying again. And that's in their theology. That's not correct. Those are like once for all. Acts 2 is the coming of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit baptizing the whole church on one day, that's a once for all event. Okay, that doesn't happen anymore. But there are things that God does. He uses the word malin, which is more and more, the Greek word. And the ministry of the Spirit is not a once-for-all thing. Although he baptized the whole church on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit continues to baptize believers every day. He continues to empower believers every day. He continues to work miracles through believers. He continues, God the Father and the Son and the Spirit, they continue to answer our prayers. And we watch him work in real time and space. So in one way, the truth of God is once for all, and it stands forever. In another way, the work of God is an ongoing event. As a matter of fact, I heard Damien Kyle say this, a pastor I love. He said he was in a church when he was a kid, and it said, we are living in Acts 29. Now that's a title for a ministry group that I don't even know what they're doing right now. But we really live in Acts 29. And you guys are going to go, let me find Acts 29. Well, Acts is only 28 chapters. But the Holy Spirit is still living out the book of Acts. The book of Acts isn't over. Okay, and I've read more charismatic people, and I've read very conservative people about this, and they all say the book of Acts isn't over. The Holy Spirit today is working in people's lives as in the book of Acts. One thing we can't do is we can't say, I want all the experiences that I've read about in Acts, right? I want to preach so long that someone falls asleep and falls out of a window and dies, and then I go raise them to life. Okay, that's going to happen. We're going to see that. So, whenever somebody nods off when I'm preaching, I go, well, they did it with Paul, so, I'm nowhere near that good, so that's cool, I get it, But, I can't claim that God's going to do that. Maybe it's a once-in-a-time event, right? But I can ask the Lord to continually fill me, continually use me, and continually help me to practice what I see practiced. So I can't preach the experience of the apostles. I'm not going to preach their experience. I'm going to experience their preaching and teaching, and I'm going to ask the Lord to do in us what He did then, and I'm going to ask the Lord to help follow the practices that they practiced. But some people think, what happened in the Bible, I'm going to claim that the Holy Spirit's going to do this right now for me. I'm going to claim healing right now. We can ask the Lord to heal us, but when we start to tell the Holy Spirit what to do, who's God? When I tell God what to do, who's God? I am. That's right, I'm God. And then God's just like a thing I manipulate for what I want. We actually come to God and say, like the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done. So when we pray for healing, we pray, Lord, please do this physical healing. But ultimately, your will be done. And we have to pray that with everything. So that's a touch of background. I think it's important because the book of Acts is such an important book. Because if we didn't have it, we would go from John to Romans, and we'd have no context. When did Paul become a believer? And why is this guy writing to the church? And who is he? Well, we find out who he is. So we can understand the New Testament because the book of Acts links the Gospels to the letters to the churches. I also want to say this last thing. It's called Acts. Initially, it wasn't titled that. Who knows? It probably wasn't titled anything. It's probably just the books that Luke wrote. And you'll hear people say, it's the Acts of the Apostles. That may be even in your Bible, the Acts of the Apostles. I don't agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Because Peter's the main guy. Chapters 1 through 12, it's Peter. And then Peter disappears. He's off the scene. And then it's Paul. And then 13 through 28, it's the life of Paul. Does it matter if it's Peter? It doesn't matter. It's the same Spirit. It doesn't matter. Like, God works through different people at all times. So, this is the Acts of the Holy Spirit. He's working through Peter in the early church. He's working through Paul. And then in Acts 29, he's working through fill in the blank. It could be you. It could be me. It should be. So let's get into the text as I've given you a little bit of an introduction to the book of Acts and why I'm so passionate about it. He said the first account I composed, so the first point in the outline is this is Luke's historical account. So when Luke writes, he writes, as I've talked to you before, he writes a number of historical events. He documents them. He documents historical locations. He even writes about depths of water in the Mediterranean Sea. Luke is writing this because when they're on the ship. Luke is writing this as a historical account. Okay, and he did the same thing with the Gospel of Luke. Let's look at the first 4 verses. They should go up behind me. He says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke went and interviewed the eyewitnesses. He has extensive account of Mary when the angel comes to Mary. Well, Luke wasn't an eyewitness, but he went to Mary and got all the documentation from Mary. It seems fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, so he, as a historian, went in and did interviews and investigated all the events to write it out for you in consecutive order. So he's writing down an orderly account for us. Most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So that's how the Gospel of Luke begins. That he is an eyewitness, that he did not witness everything, but he has interviewed the eyewitnesses, and now he's relating this to Theophilus. So he says, the first account I composed, Theophilus. So that's how we know Luke and Acts have the same author, Luke. Theophilus means lover of God. And some people believe that Theophilus was a high-ranking Roman official who converted to Christianity. Some even think that at some point Luke may have served him as a physician's slave, because the physicians back then were slaves. Today we're slaves of the physicians. You can use that anyway. Yeah, so just kidding. But they were slaves. So some people believe that he was doing that ministry, or that work to Theophilus. That may or may not be the case. I don't have internal evidence inside the scriptures to tell you that's the case. But we believe that Theophilus, who's the audience, was a high-ranking Roman official who came to Christ. And now he's going to get a complete defense as to the gospel and to the working of Christ, and even to Paul's ministry. And at some points it's going to read like a legal defense. He said, about all that Jesus began to do and teach, so from the beginning of Christ's life and through his teaching, until the day he was taken up to heaven. So that's the ascension. Remember, he resurrects, and he's on the earth for 40 days. Now, we have accounts of who he appeared to in 1 Corinthians 15. He appeared many times to people post resurrection, but then he was taken up 40 days later. And then he told them before he was taken up to wait. We'll get into that. Taken up to heaven. And after he had, by the Holy Spirit, given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen, so he tells them in that 40 days he's continuing to teach them by the power of the Holy Spirit what they're to do. To these he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over a period of 40 days, and speaking of the things concerning the kingdom of God. So Luke is documenting a historical account. It is from the beginning of Christ's ministry, now to the ascension was Luke, and now from the ascension through the church being birthed. And it's very clear here that Christ, it says, presented himself alive after his sufferings by many convincing proofs. He appeared to the disciples. Post-resurrection, he only is handled by loving hands. The Romans, guards who beat him, and the religious leaders, and the Roman officials, he's not appearing to them. They had their shot. They rejected him. He appears to the believers after his resurrection. And he shows them many ways that he was alive. I told you about the fact that when they're fishing, he's on the shore cooking broiled fish for breakfast. And then he eats. So for those of you who like to eat, those of us who like to eat, we will eat in our glorified bodies. So I'm looking forward to heavenly donuts. That's the time for that. But they saw many convincing proofs. He is proving to them, I've died, you know I've died, and now I've resurrected. David Limbaugh, you may have heard of his brother. David's way better than his brother. Like super way better. Okay, David Limbaugh is a Christian apologist. David came to Christ in a dramatic way. He actually was an atheist for a long time. And David did the same thing that Josh McDowell did. He studied the claims of Christ historically, and he did it as a lawyer. It's called Jesus on Trial is the name of his book. And it's a lawyer's account from atheism to faith. And if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's a great book. But he outlines how we can trust in the historicity of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. And ultimately, at the end, you're asked, what are you going to do with this Jesus Christ? And I love the fact that these minds have looked at the evidence and said, you know what? It's true. It's historically accurate. It actually happened. Like if I came to you today and said, you know what? I know you've been told your whole life that this guy named George Washington was our first president. It wasn't really George Washington. It was George Benson, you know. And you're like, who's that? You go, no. I've been to D.C. I've read the historical documents. I've seen it. I've studied the history. That's not true. We know historically that George Washington was our first president. You can know from the historical facts that Christ lived, died, and resurrected. And I sent some of you, Ben Shapiro has these Sunday talks, and he had William Lane Craig in. And if you haven't watched it, you need to. Because Ben Shapiro is asking him about proofs for God, and he's giving him the proofs for God. And there's great reasons to believe that there's a divine being. If you're an atheist, as the book we're reading for book club for next week, which we're going to meet next week because we had some conflicts this week, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. If you read it, you'll realize it takes a lot more faith to believe nothing produced nothing than to produce someone that produced something. Okay? It takes a lot more, how did something come out of nothing? It takes a lot more faith to be an atheist. And so, Ben has him on. And William Lane Craig is laying out the proofs for how you can believe that there's a God. And Ben believes there's a God because he's a Jew. And he gets to proof 5, Jesus of Nazareth. And he tries to lay the gospel out, right? And I'm sitting there, and he talks about the resurrection. And Ben's response, who's a great debater, his response was, yeah, I'm a Jew, I'm really not interested in that. I was like, what? What? Is it historically accurate or not? It's fascinating. And then he mentions this guy, Bill Schmierson, who the Jews in New York believe it was the Messiah who died in, I think, 92. And they believe he's going to resurrect when we're ready for him. They believed he was the Messiah when we were ready and all this stuff. And he mentions him. Many people have said they were the Messiah and they died. And William Lane Craig very kindly, who was great on the resurrection, said, yeah, but I bet their tomb's not empty. Yeah, you can hear a pin drop. But the point is that historically you can prove that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, okay? I mean, they guarded the tomb and then the tomb was empty. How did the tomb get empty? And then his church, the book of Acts, is a proof for how Jesus is resurrected. Because you've got these guys who are in hiding. Then they see the risen Christ. And then they're in prayer. And then the Holy Spirit comes. And these guys who were not trained in the rabbinic schools of the time, they are schooling the religious leaders on the Old Testament. And they keep getting beat for it. And they don't stop. They don't shut up. And the world would like us to just shut our mouths. We kind of migrated over to YouTube because YouTube is supposed to be the area of free speech, and now YouTube is starting to clamp down on free speech. Trust me, there's a point that what is going out on the internet to prove Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is going to get more clamped down on than it is right now. Okay? And you know that many Western countries have hate speech laws. And we all go, well, who wants to say something hateful? Well, is saying Jesus Christ is the only way to God hateful? It is to many people. Cognitive abuse, have you heard about that one? Richard Dawkins was asked, and forgive me because this will turn your stomach, what do you think about the Roman Catholic sexual abuse scandal? And Peter Hitchens in his book, which is such a good book, Rage Against God, how radical atheism took an atheist to Christianity. Because Peter Hitchens, have you heard of his brother? I think we've all heard of his brother. Christopher, who passed away in 2011. In 2010, Peter wrote this book. He wrote that book, God Is Not Great. And Peter actually responds to his brother in this book, lovingly. And at one point says, people are not great, which is a great line. But he mentions in this book how Christopher Hitchens was asked about the sex scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. And you know what his response was? What those priests did to those boys was not worse than being raised a Catholic. And we go, oh! But that's where our world's moving, to cognitive abuse. You can only tell your kids about God when they consent, when they're 18. And if you don't think it's true, start to read what the UN wants to do with their kids. Just read it. Read it. It's going to be illegal in your own home to teach your kids about the Lord. in many Western nations. It's coming. It's coming. But we're not going to shut up. Okay? You can come find me. We're not going to shut up. And we're going to leave it at that. Because and I'm thankful we have the First Amendment. I'm thankful for that as an American. And I don't say political things very often, but I'm always going to vote First Amendment. Freedom to assemble as a church. Freedom to teach the gospel. Amen. I told people when I left Canada, why are you leaving Canada? Because it's a great country. I said, because I want my First Amendment rights back. I'm sick and tired of the government here. I'm like, what's wrong with you? You really want to know? And you know what? Under the Roman government, where you could believe anything, the exclusive belief that Christ was the only way to God was the reason why the Christians got persecuted. Nero used to burn Christians alive. Didn't stop it. Couldn't hold it down. Religiosity, feel-good church, those churches will fold like cheap suits. But the people who really believe that this is the truth, you will not stop it. That's why China is, what are they doing? Clamping down on Christians. Why? Why? Because they can't stop the growth of the church. They can't stop it. The Soviet Union, what did they do with religion? One of the first things they did was they introduced language laws. Honestly, when they first took over, one of the first things they did, educate because they wanted the kids, and then language laws. And they said, you cannot capitalize God anymore. God has to be lowercase. Right? Small g. One of the first things they did. And you're going to read about people who would not shut up because the convincing proofs they had realized that this Jesus Christ lived, died, resurrected. And the only way to God and forgiveness is in His name. The only way to peace is in His name. What is our problem as a nation? We're not reconciled to God. What's our problem as individuals? When we walk away from the power of the Spirit. I have one major problem in my life, and it's me. When my flesh gets in the way of the work of the Spirit, I'm bad news, dude. Right? And so we have to understand this is about the power of the Spirit. So then he says in verse 4, gathering them together, he commanded them not to leave Jerusalem, but to wait for what the Father had promised. So he tells them, you need to stay here, you need to stay in Jerusalem, you need to wait for what the Father had promised, which he had told them about. The night he was betrayed, he had them in the upper room. He does what's called the upper room discourse. John 13 through 16, he teaches them about the Holy Spirit extensively in that passage. He said, he's coming. He said, for John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now. So we think of water baptism, the element you go under is water. When the Holy Spirit comes, the element that completely immerses you is the Holy Spirit. And he says, you're going to get that not many days from now. Now, they knew of the Holy Spirit because in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit would come on particular people at particular times for particular jobs. Right? It would come on the kings. So David was he was with Saul. Saul had the Spirit, and the Spirit left him. If you read, one of the saddest verses in the Bible is when we read about Samson. And it says that Samson did not know the Spirit of God had left him. That's when he falls. When the Spirit of God had left him. David, when he gets confronted by Nathan, the prophet, because the prophet always confronted the king, what God has said, you sin with Bathsheba. He prays. Remember? It's Psalm 51. Take not your Holy Spirit from me. I love the song Create Me a Clean Heart, but that's not theologically correct, because he doesn't do that in the New Testament. Once you're baptized with the Spirit, you have the Holy Spirit. Now you may grieve the Holy Spirit. You may resist the Holy Spirit. But he doesn't take it from you in the New Testament time. So they knew of the Holy Spirit, but they had no idea that en masse the whole church was going to be baptized in this Holy Spirit. Completely new teaching. So when they came together, they were asking him, in verse 6, so this is kind of verses 4 through 8, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, if you're a note taker. So We've got Luke makes an accurate account, verses 1 to 3. Baptism of the Holy Spirit is verses 4 to 8. He says, so when they had come together, they were asking him, Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? The Jews had an understanding that there would be a literal kingdom in Jerusalem. It's all through the Old Testament. It's all through the minor prophets. And I want to pull up a verse right now from Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 to 4. And when I read this, you're going to go, I've heard this verse before. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So a literal physical kingdom where the nations will come to Jerusalem and learn of God's laws. And he will judge between the nations and will render decisions. For many peoples. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Now it's fascinating because in Joel, when they go to attack the Lord, they take their plowshares and their spears, they take their pruning hooks and beat them into spears and their plowshares to beat them into swords. It's the exact opposite in Joel 3, in the day of the Lord. And nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never will they learn war. So if you go to the UN, which unfortunately is in America, you're going to see there's a swords and the plowshares sculpture that's in the park across from the UN. And a Soviet guy has this man beating his sword into a plowshare. And the UN is trying to accomplish that verse through their work. And I'd have to say they've been incredibly successful in starting war. They haven't really brought peace to us, have they? The Jews call them the United Nothings. I'll tell you that's what they think. But you'll see that, and you'll hear that. Beat the swords and the plowshares, and their spears and the pruning hooks. So they're not going to fight. They're going to work the land. But that is a time that is in the future. Okay, that is the time when Jesus does rule and reign from Jerusalem. That's when he sits on the throne of David, which Mary heard. He'll be great, be called Son of the Most High, in Luke 1. He'll sit on the throne of his father David. When's that going to happen? There's a time after this world. Okay, it's going to rebel against the Lord. There's 70 weeks of Daniel. And at the end of that, Battle of Armageddon, Jesus will set up a physical kingdom in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. It's called the Millennial Kingdom. We read Revelation 20, and all through the minor prophets, and we're going to have peace. Okay? The world's going to try to do it. The world's been trying to do it on its own. We're horrible at it, and now God's going to bring us peace through His Son. So the kingdom of Israel is a eschatological question about the millennial kingdom which comes in the future. And these guys, they're thinking, okay, you've resurrected from the dead. It's time now we set the kingdom up. You know, they were talking about who's going to sit on your right hand and your left hand. You're ready, man. Ready for the kingdom. And it's interesting because he doesn't say no. He doesn't say yes. He says to them, it is not for you to know the times or epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority. But you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in both Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, even to the remotest part of the earth. See, the kingdom that's going to come in the millennial time is when Christ rules and reigns over people. The kingdom that he's building right now is Christ is transforming individual lives. And they have the Holy Spirit. And they're living, we should be living out that fruit. And living like Christ. And so it's a little picture of what the kingdom will be in the future. Alright? But there's a future kingdom coming biblically. And it's not yet. But we see little traces of it when we watch the Holy Spirit work in a life of what it's like to live under His authority. But it's not kingdom time yet. He says, you'll receive power, which is dunamis. We get our word dynamite from that Greek word, to be witnesses, which is a term we get from somebody who The martyr came out of that Greek word, and it's one who sheds light on something, one who is a witness. So the power that they get from the Holy Spirit is to be a living martyr, a living testimony to who Jesus Christ is. And they're going to do it everywhere. And I love it says to the remotest parts of the earth. I always think, compared to Jerusalem, we live in a remote part of the earth. So the gospel came here by the Holy Spirit, by witnesses. And this is going to happen. And at this point, we talk about that idea, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, that He's going to come and He's going to change, and everything's going to be new, and everything's going to be fresh. The old seems to come back, doesn't it? Right? Jen told me that mustaches and bell bottoms are back in big time in California, which is cool. And Andrew told me, Dad, you gotta listen to this really cool new music. I was like, okay, what is it? He said it's L-O-F-I, like lo-fi. I said, okay. He said it's like instrumental music. So we put it on. Jen and I are listening to some keyboard and some stuff. Jen looks at him and says, Andrew, we used to call this elevator music. She said, this is what we had to listen to in the dentist office and doctor's office. Before pop music, you know, I love that. You're sitting in the doctor's office, you're waiting to go and see the doctor, and they're playing like, you know, Katy Perry, and they're going, you know, they go, your blood pressure's high. Of course it is. You hear the music I had to listen to? It's driving me crazy. You know, go back with the lo-fi, the lo-fi, whatever you call it, the elevator music. It's supposed to be really hot now, okay? I was howling. I was like, elevator music is cool. Yeah, so the old, it comes back around, and so this idea of witnesses, this is going to be a continual cycle. Every generation is going to be new witnesses, new conversions, baptism of the Holy Spirit. And every generation has to be willing to hold to the truth of the gospel. I was talking to Roy this week, and in Peter Hitchens' book, they both said the same thing. They said, go to a church. You see people 70 and over. He said, and then you see people like 45 and younger. He said, where are all this, you know, this late 50s and 60s people? Now, I don't really know all your ages, and I don't even presume to know them, and then maybe some of you in that demographic. But Roy said the same thing. Roy said, when he does ministry, he says they try to minister to his generation. He says, because by and large, they're out of church. And a lot of them are. They are. And a lot of younger people are coming back to church because they've heard there's no truth, there's no God, do whatever you want, and they've seen how that's just created tremendous destruction in lives. And so many younger people are coming back to the Word. So this idea of witnesses is going to be perpetuated throughout time and throughout all space around this world. We're going to continue to see the gospel move forward. And every new generation has to claim this verse 1:8 and has to hold on to it, has to live it out, has to realize that the power comes from the Holy Spirit, that they are just witnesses, that they are just conduits getting the message out. We talked to the worship team today, they're just doorkeepers, right? You open the door, Psalm 84, much rather be a doorman in the house of the Lord. Like, yeah, anywhere else. Just, hey, come on in. Come visit with the Lord. It's all about Him. And then in verse 9 and 10, and I'll start to wrap up with that, this idea of the ascension. After He said these things, He was lifted up while we were looking on. So they were looking on, and the cloud received Him out of their sight. So this is what we call the ascension. Because people will say, Lazarus came back to life. He was dead and came back to life. But Lazarus died again. Christ died, resurrected, to never die again. So He ascends. He goes directly into heaven. And then they're looking up at the sky, and two angels in white clothes stand before them. Say, Men of Galilee, why are you standing looking up into the sky? This Jesus, who's been taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way, just as you watched Him go into heaven. So we believe that in a future time, when people talk about the second coming of Christ, that's exactly what He's talking about here. We believe that He's going to put His foot on the Mount of Olives. It talks about that in Zechariah 4:14, and the mountain's going to split. Jesus Christ is physically coming back to this earth. But right now, we know where he is out of Hebrews 1:1-3. And I'll just read verse 3. He says that he, that's Christ, is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, and he upholds all things by the word of his power, which is a great verse. When he had made purification for sin, that's once for all, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So where's Jesus right now? He's seated at the right hand of the Father, making intercession for you as the Lamb that was slain. Now when we get to Acts 7, Stephen is being murdered, Jesus Christ stands up. So just so you know, right now he's seated. So when you go to pray and you say, Lord, he's at the right hand of the Father, he's making intercession for us, he ascended, so he's still alive in his glorified state, and he will come back. The second coming will be when he comes back physically, not the rapture of the church. That's a different thing. That's when he comes in the clouds to gather the church. When he comes and puts his foot down on the Mount of Olives, that's his second coming. So that's a different return. All right? And so they are told he is coming back. He's ascended and he's coming back. And they've been told to go wait for the coming of the Holy Spirit. Next week we're going to see how they wait, and that's, I think, vitally important to keep that in the back of your mind. The message of Christ here that we can draw from is historically accurate. We are witnesses because of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is released in our lives to do that ministry. And we believe about this physical event that he ascended, that he went up. It's all historically documented. And it's fascinating because when you think about it, I was reading that book about Peter Hitchens about atheism. And many atheists have said, Huxley was one, he said, we are atheists not because we believe it, or it's more plausible than faith, but because we want to be able to do what we want to do. It's true. No God, do what you want. That's why Turk wrote that book, Stealing from God, how atheists have to steal their moral categories from God. Because if there is no God, it is survival of the fittest. And it is the strong will survive. If there is a God, there's someone we're all accountable to. That's not us. And the question is, as we hear about this morning, we hear about the historicity of Christ's life, death, resurrection, ascension, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Like you have to ask yourself, where am I at in this process? There's one baptism of many fillings. Do you need to be refilled this morning? Maybe you're like, hey, you know what? I really feel like I need to be close to the Lord. What you read, what you watch, what you think about is going to draw the Holy Spirit. He's like a pilot light. If you've ever had a stove with a pilot light, he's there. But to crank that flame up, you've got to add gas. Now, how do we add the gas to the pilot light? Time in the Word, time in prayer, time in holy living. All that stuff will make that little flame into an inferno. So we're going to sing a couple worship songs. Roy's going to come up and kind of give a call if you need prayer. We have a room over to the right that we can reach in if you need some prayer this morning. And I'm just going to close with a word of prayer here and then raise some worship. Lord, we thank you for your word. And what a great journey we're getting on, Lord. I'm so excited to walk through the book of Acts with my church family. And I just pray this morning that you would help us, Lord, as we think about that idea of receiving the power of the Spirit. That, Lord, may the Spirit have freedom in our lives and in this church to do the work that he wants to do. He will bring glory and honor to the risen Jesus. He will point us to the revelation